Castle Chansany, Volume 1, written by Charlotte E. English and narrated by Diana Croft. The far below. The object, whatever it was, rapidly disappeared into the impenetrable milk-white mists surrounding the walls of Castle Chansany. Jessamine listened in vain for the sound of its eventual impact, far below. Far below. An awful silence followed this event, lasting some time. Jessamine broke it at last. "Something's fallen over the side." Saying it aloud made the terrible truth feel all the more real, and Jessamine's sinuous tail began an uncontrollable twitching. Weren't there supposed to be wards and such? Invisible but infallible enchantments swaddling the sky-high castle in a comforting shroud of safety? Winds of magic, currents of gramarye. Nothing was ever supposed to go over the side. And Jessamine had not even the first idea what it had been. She'd strolled out to the balcony to take the air, puffing an amusing stream of perfumed smoke from her delicate nostrils, paused to enjoy the aesthetic delights of the rainbow-coloured forest flowers, rambling from pot to pot and sprawling languorously along the silver fences. And then, it had happened. An object, small and fast-moving, had gone hurtling down. She might have sworn, in fact, that the thing had hurled itself off the balcony and into thin air. Nobody spoke. She was alone out here, then, not even a sylph wafting about upon the dulcet breezes. Humph! No one to talk the matter over with. Also, no witnesses. Jessamine curled up at the base of one ornate, glinting fence and shut her eyes a moment, pondering. If no one had perceived the event save for herself, was it necessary to make anything of it? Perhaps she hadn't even seen it. Perhaps it hadn't happened at all. Her draconic lips stretched in a blissful smile, and for some 3 or 4 minutes she dozed in the golden sun, comforted by these charming ideas. But no, it wouldn't do. Something had gone over. Something that glittered oddly in the sunlight, and if one didn't put a stop to such behaviour, well, who knew what might go over next? It might be one of the flower pots, so pretty with their cerulean glaze. It might be somebody's hair comb all over jewels, and the royal court wouldn't stand for that. It might be the first favourite spell book, and then she'd be for it. Jessamine's eyes snapped open in horror. All thought of slumber gone. Something had to be done. Not a doubt of it. "I suppose," she gulped, "I'll have to fetch the wizard." Her ensuing trek through the castle was of the lengthy character guaranteed to leave her out of breath and patience both. But eventually, she ran across the Wizard Garstang, near enough literally. He sat cross-legged upon the floor, his velvet-clad behind parked upon a curlicued rug, and tucked behind an ornate screen in a corner of somebody's bedchamber. Jessamine hadn't the faintest notion whose. He sat alone, but the profusion of silver coffee pots scattered about him, together with far too many cups, saucers, and silver spoons, strongly implied he had recently enjoyed company. Rather a lot of it. "Wizard!" puffed Jessamine, her lashing tail toppling a hapless coffee pot or two. "You're needed at the edge." "The edge?" repeated the wizard. Being face down in a near-empty pot at that moment, deeply inhaling the dregs of whatever had once occupied it, he took no note of Jessamine's state whatsoever. "Which edge, my dear dragon, and why?" "The hindmost southwestern balcony," she snapped. "That edge. And you're wanted because something's gone over." That brought him out of the depths of his pot. He raised his head and blinked his dark eyes several times. Full of steam, she thought, or some such perfume. One never knew with the wizard. "Gone over? Gone over where?" "Gone over down." "What was it?" "How should I know? 'Twas a blur of something glitterish and then gone." "You didn't throw it, did you?" Jessamine began to swell with indignation. But before she had more than half doubled in size, the wizard grinned and said, "I had to ask, Jessamine, did I not? Admit it, you're in just the mood to engage in a spot of target practice." "Were your head the goal, mayhap?" she conceded. "Quite," said the wizard, accepting this with admirable grace. "But it wasn't you." "'Twas not me. I was sunning myself, peaceful as you like, and there it was, gone." At last, something like disquiet entered the wizard's expression. He sat for a moment in thought, tapping a coffee-stained finger against one lip. "Well," he said, rising abruptly to his feet and towering over Jessamine, "then something ought to be done, oughtn't it?" The balcony was just as Jessamine had left it, flourishing with verdure and empty of company. The wizard spent some little time with his folded arms resting atop the balcony fence and gazing into the far below. Jessamine peeked, too, balanced atop the fence with her long tail wrapped tightly around the bars to steady her. There was not much to be seen for all the white clouds in the way, but perhaps the wizard's eyes saw more than Jessamine could. "There appears to be a hole," he said after a while. Jessamine looked, but saw nothing of the sort, and said so. "A hole in the veil," he clarified, with a trace of impatience. "The veil, which is there, I might add, precisely to catch such things as would otherwise tumble down." "Or people," put in Jessamine. "Those as well." "And how did it get there?" "The hole. Someone must be tinkering with my arrangements." He uttered this in tones of grave displeasure, which one couldn't wonder at. "What then do we do?" said Jessamine. "I suppose we must find this person." "I suppose we'll have to go down," said the wizard instead. "After all, until we know what the object was, it is useless to try to guess who wanted it." "You think it was a stolen thing?" "I don't see what other use there would be in making holes in my lovely veil." Someone at Castle Chansany was a thief. The notion shocked Jessamine a fair bit, for the castle did not receive newcomers often, nor did very many people leave. Most of those who were in residence were always in residence, and how could any of them be so disobliging as to steal from someone else? Her tail began a staccato twitching at its tip, a fair sign of her anger, and since the result was a wobbling and a near toppling from the balcony fence, she hastily got down. After all, there was a hole in the veil. "You'll mend the hole?" she said, for the wizard had put out a hand to steady her, and why would he have done that if he wasn't afraid for her possible demise? He was the forgetful sort, likely to hare off in search of the culprit and leave the problem unremedied. "All in good time," he said. "Ah," said Jessamine. Well, that was that then. "So it's down for you?" "For us, Jessamine. I'll want my familiar with me. Our culprit and our object both might be down there after all." "Me to go down," said the dragon with a smoky sigh. "But it's far below." "You've got wings." "And little practice at using them." Jessamine had not been a dragon for long. Only scant weeks ago she'd been a half-fae with 2 legs only, and not a wing to her name. "Here, then, is an excellent opportunity." Jessamine muttered something, stretched the fiery wings in question, and beat them back and forth. Air moved, but nothing much else. Certainly not Jessamine. "They're too weak," she announced. "They'll never hold me." The wizard's only answer to this was a gust of air, cold air, which swirled about Jessamine's clawed feet and wafted her into the sky. He himself had already summoned his favourite chair, the best of all chairs. The thing came swooping in on its gossamer wings and caught the wizard up in its velvet-cushioned seat. The pair hovered, and so did Jessamine. "Tarry a moment," said she, flailing. "I tell you I cannot fly." "You must imagine better, my dragon," said the wizard gaily, and soared away. Some last few words came drifting back with the winds of his passage. "The feat is only a thought away." Only a thought. And the thoughts passing through Jessamine's mind were not, at that moment, of the sort suited to a public airing. She growled and spat a little flame over the edge. It winked out of life in mid-air, smothered to death by all that nothing. "Well, and so shall I be," said Jessamine with resignation, and chucked herself over the side. She had a fair view of the castle from this inverted posture, and ample time as she plummeted down to admire all the beauties rapidly dwindling in size. Those turrets really were lovely, all the glass twinkling in the sun so. A frantic flurry of her smoky wings failed altogether to slow her descent. Pity she'd not had another of Chef's butter cakes for breakfast. She could have, but she'd thought of her girth and refrained. Fool! For what use had a dragon for a svelte frame if her wings didn't work and she was to be squashed flat in the far below anyway? An impact came, sooner than expected. It hurt. Knocked all the breath out of her in a whoosh. But it wasn't the squashing kind of an experience. Another breath came. She'd shut her fiery eyes when she thought of Chef's butter cakes. She opened them and saw the wizard. "Tisk, dragon," said he, smiling at her. He'd caught her as she fell, doubtless with a fancy flourish of his wizarded chair, and she was saved. "Not so much for flying these," she croaked, wafting smoke. "Since that's so, you might stop flapping them about," said the wizard with a cough. "I'd sooner breathe air than smoke." Jessamine, frightened into unwanted obedience, stopped. By the time she'd caught her own breath and calmed the shaking in her limbs, the wizard had brought the best of all chairs to a swooping halt upon some blessedly firm ground, and Jessamine was able to alight from her seat. The far below turned out to be leafy in character, and not much else. "There's a forest here," said she in surprise. "Well, of course there is," said the wizard, striding off. The best of all chairs gambolled along after him, far more delighted than either of its passengers at this unscheduled outing. What else should there be in the far below, pray? Jessamine had often peeped over the side, but had never glimpsed aught but wafts of clouds and mist. She'd dreamed up many a fanciful thing that may lie beneath, but the wizard, he'd had the misfortune of knowing. Now Jessamine knew too, and a few airy dreams slipped away in consequence. She sighed. Still, it was more forest than she'd ever seen before, and interest revived. She had no names to put to the trees she saw, but they were vanishingly tall, and broad about their sleek brown trunks. Boughs reached out a long, long way, decked in all that extravagant greenery, and there was emerald-coloured moss up and down them, and all over the floor. She saw ferns, too. These she did know, for some of the court ladies liked to keep them in pots, and there were some upon the balconies. "I'd like a fern," she announced. The wizard was questing. She knew it from the purposeful stride and the set to the jaw, not to mention the rapt look in his eyes. but he answered her from some disengaged part of his great wizard's brain. "Then you'll have the best of all ferns, Jessamine, but first, help me find the object." Yes, the object. Distracted by all this far below splendour, Jessamine had forgotten the purpose of the quest altogether. The object. Whatever it was had fallen right through the clouds and must have ended up amongst the ferns and the moss. But how were they to find it? 'Twas a small object, and a large far below. She said this. "Am I not a wizard?" answered he, "and do I not have a familiar at my elbow?" Jessamine, being farther away than that, scurried to catch up. He and the chair were fairly off, trampling ferns aplenty in their haste. Jessamine flitted along behind, unsure what, as familiar, she was to do. "There's a cantrip," said the wizard, "scribed upon the 18th page in the volume of 13 Seasons Past." He meant the second favourite spell book. Jessamine knew that one. "It is for finding a lost thing. And now that I think of it, I ought perhaps to have brought the book with me." Jessamine gave a smoky sigh, curling the delicate leaves of a few passing ferns. "Besides, how are we to use a cantrip on a thing when we've no notion of its identity?" She was looking all around as she scuttled along, her bright eyes on the watch for anything that looked out of place, anything that was patently not part of this verdant and squelchy far below. But she could spend a year at the task and catch not a whiff of it, she knew. "We must find assistance," declared the wizard after a moment's thought. "From the second favourite book?" Jessamine had a vision of the thing, called from far away and hastening to obey its master's summons, hurling itself over the side as she had done and plummeting down. "No, I have not the book with me. Did I not say that?" "Then where's this assistance to come from?" said Jessamine, "for we're all alone, if you haven't noticed." Not so much as a rustle of leaves had she heard, save those she and the wizard made themselves. Not even any brisk, scurrying creatures among the undergrowth were there, for with the clamour they were making they'd frightened the lot away. But the wizard looked up. "Ah," said Jessamine, espying something feathered and with a long tail. It wafted along the winds far above, glimmering blue and red in the dulcet sunlight. She thought it would come down, convinced in her befuddled way that all about must obey the wizard's summons as she did. But the bird did not come down. "There," said the wizard presently, not deigning to point. Jessamine glimpsed it, perhaps, a flicker of green, but then there was so much green. How was she to tell one sort from the other? "Something moss-coloured?" she hazarded, "but up far too high." "Here it comes." The wizard waited, holding himself unusually still, rare for the man to adjust his own behaviour to suit another's needs. He was trying not to scare the scrap of a creature decked in wing that came wafting slowly down. "'Twas a dragon," gathered Jessamine, and couldn't speak for shock. At least, not for a moment or two. "Well," she spat, curiously affronted, "if 'twas a dragon you wanted, had you not dragons in sufficient number?" It wasn't even an impressive specimen, being far smaller than Jessamine herself, and all skin and bone. A youngling, barely out of the egg. "But this one flies," said the Wizard Garstang, with a smirk at his familiar. Jessamine might have sulked, save that the wizard's expressions were becoming known to her. She detected beneath the smirk a conspiratorial smile, something of fellowship in this invitation to share a joke, though it came at her expense, and she settled down. Perhaps he was not fixing to replace her with this delicate thing at that. The newcomer frisked in delight under the wizard's gaze. She would soon be cured of that, thought Jessamine sourly, and condescended to sniff the creature, politely enough. It smelled of loam and sap, and a whiff of petrichor, not unpleasant. The wizard spoke gently to it. It was only a baby, Jessamine reminded herself. It warranted gentleness even if she didn't. "Tell me, my tiny fellow, have you seen an object lately fall from the heavens?" And he pointed upwards, quite as though the dragon might comprehend. It didn't. Jessamine read this in its behaviour, perfectly unchanged, say the wizard what he would. It gambolled, it coquetted for attention, shameless thing, and it made a curious sound, brrr, and chirped. Some day it might grow larger and develop, with all its new bulk and intellect, and perhaps even an identity. Until then, it could hardly be worth talking to. "Perfect," said the wizard, beaming. "What a fine fellow you are!" He fed it something. Jessamine could not determine what, though it smelled sharp and savoury. "What?" said she. "And have you derived meaning from this nonsense?" "Haven't you? I must say I'm surprised." The wizard attempted, with a wave of his bejewelled fingers, to dismiss the dragon. The little creature proved impervious to suggestion. "You fed it," observed Jessamine. "A mistake, that." "Well, then you shall have a companion," decided the wizard. "He'll be a fine creature once grown, though perhaps too big for the castle." "Tell me what it said," interrupted Jessamine, impatient with this vision. "Something fell," answered he, in tones of surprise, as though this ought to have been obvious. "We knew that, of course, but now we have some idea as to where." As if these words had themselves proved a spur, he was off, swooping away in his wizarded chair. Jessamine scuttled along in his wake. If she fluttered her wings hard enough, they proved effective to boost her speed, even if not to lift her aloft. She made full use of them and barely kept up. The interloper, scarcely inconvenienced by the wizard's pace, fluttered along too. "Where are we going?" she called after her master. "What I truly asked," caroled he, "is whether anything fell that did not belong, and our little friend has seen only one object that he could not recognize. It glittered sharply and caught the sun, and it fell somewhere in this direction." Jessamine, growing short of breath, paused and took in the extent of the damp forest before her. Reams and reams of it, with no end in sight, and all frondy besides. "Absurd! Absurd!" cried she. "Do you seek to stumble over it in all this fernery? It will never happen. We shall be here until year's end." "I don't at all," said the wizard agreeably, slowing. "But you, perhaps." "Oh," said Jessamine, for there it was, lying quietly at her feet. Such an innocent thing, inert among the moss, for all the world as though it had not led her and the wizard a merry dance all the way from the castle. "There," said the wizard with vast satisfaction. "You always had a lucky way about you, Jessamine." This being too patently absurd for words, Jessamine ignored it. "Well then, and what is it?" The wizard came swooping back, the wings of his chair stirring the drooping ferns. "It is a spoon." Wizard Garstang halted before this felled treasure and regarded it in silence. In point of fact, the spoon was bright silver, recently polished, a fine wrought thing, fit for nobles to use at table, though in size it seemed more suited to the tea-tray. Or possibly the coffee-pot. Jessamine's mind wandered back a ways, to where she'd found the wizard, reposed upon the floor, surrounded by a decimated collection of beverages and a quantity of spoons. "It is your spoon," she accused. The wizard did not answer. "It is just like all the others you had about you," she persisted. "Nonsense," said the wizard briskly. "The castle must be full of such articles." "Doubtless," Jessamine agreed. "But how would one of those come to fall down into the far below?" "Well, and how do you imagine a spoon of mine should have done so?" He was growing testy, the scowl building upon his brow. Jessamine, recognizing the signs, persevered. "Because you threw it." He scoffed and spluttered something incomprehensible. "Perhaps you were in a temper," said she, serene. "Or perhaps you were showing off, for I doubt me not that there were ladies present. Was it not so?" The wizard, unusually, was silent. If anybody else were to throw a thing with sufficient force to hurl it over the side, its descent should, in all likelihood, be prevented by your wizardly veil. Jessamine, becoming smug, permitted herself a snicker. "But if you were to throw it, wizard mine, how different a story. There's a fine hole burned in your veil, I'll be bound, and a long afternoon's work ahead to mend it." The wizard bent and collected the spoon. He examined it briefly and then tucked it away into a pocket in his velvet coat. "Tell no one of this, Jessamine?" "I might, perhaps, be encouraged to hold my peace," she conceded, "if I were to be suitably recompensed." The Wizard Garstang sighed. "Shall it be comfits again? I'll speak to the kitchen." "Comfits aplenty," said Jessamine sternly, "and 2 or 3 butter cakes." The wizard eyed her. "You could ask more, but I shan't, for I'm a reasonable dragon." "And are you to assist me in mending this hole I've burned in the veil?" Jessamine gave the matter due consideration. "No, I shouldn't think so," she decided, "for the sun is not yet gone, and I've a nap to finish."